The fluorescent lights of Seattle General's emergency department buzz like angry wasps overhead, their hum constant and inescapable, mixing with the rhythm of monitors and the soft squeak of rubber-soled shoes on linoleum. Brooke Sullivan moves through the 2 a.m. shift with the kind of invisibility that only comes from years of practice, the practiced invisibility of someone who learned long ago that being noticed was dangerous. Her scrubs are faded teal, at least 2 sizes too large, hanging loose on a frame that suggests she's forgotten to eat again. There's a limp in her left leg that worsens by hour 6, barely perceptible to anyone not trained to look for compensatory movement patterns, the kind of thing that appears only when exhaustion strips away the muscle memory that usually masks it. Her hands, though. Her hands are the problem. They move with precision through the vital signs check on Bay 3, blood pressure cuff securing, thermometer positioning, for sight assessment, but there's a tremor underneath it all, a fine vibration that speaks of something her background would never admit to anyone watching. The tremor is not fear. Not anymore. The tremor is habit, the ghost of adrenaline from a place she doesn't talk about, from a time when her hands performed the same movements but under different lights, in sand instead of tile, with rounds instead of monitors providing the percussion of her work. Here at Seattle General, the tremor just makes her look nervous. Makes her look like a nurse who doubts herself. Makes her look like someone worth dismissing. That's exactly what she wants them to see. The pharmacy system's access code still feels wrong on her fingers after 3 weeks, but her credentials are solid enough. Captain Brooke Sullivan, RN, registered with the state of Washington, her background checked, her references impeccable, her presence at Seattle General entirely unremarkable. The billing codes are what caught her attention first, the patterns visible only to someone trained to spot discrepancies in logistics, in supply chains, in the way resources move through systems. Phantom CT scans ordered for uninsured patients in Bay 7 and Bay 9, images recorded in the system but never actually generated, then written off at triple cost as charity care. The mathematics of it is elegant and brutal. Someone is making money off the hospital's guilt, off its obligation to provide care, off the simple fact that nobody questions the documentation when the documentation is already done. She catalogs medication waste in the pharmacy system at 2:17 a.m., her fingers moving through screens with the speed of someone who knows exactly what she's looking for. Expired doses marked as destroyed. Controlled substances with missing milliliters. The pattern emerges slowly, like a photograph developing in solution, there but not obvious, visible but deniable. She documents everything. Date, time, discrepancy, her initials. The paper trail grows, stacked digital brick by digital brick, and she understands that what she's building is not documentation. What she's building is a weapon. Dr. Mercer hasn't noticed her yet, not really. He's too busy being Dr. Mercer, the kind of attending physician who wears his superiority like a tailored suit, all sharp edges and sharper words, the kind of man who can make a resident cry with a single glance and then move on to his coffee as if something meaningful had just occurred. He moves through the hospital with the certainty of someone whose family's money and his family's connections have guaranteed that the world will bend to accommodate him. His eyes are the color of ice in February, pale and cold and used to getting what they want. At 6'2", he carries himself with the unconscious arrogance of someone who has never once questioned whether he deserved the space he occupied. What he doesn't see is Brooke. She's invisible to him the way she's invisible to most of them, the way prey animals are invisible to predators who aren't hungry yet. Just another middle-aged ER nurse, competent enough, quiet enough, the kind of person who works the night shift by choice and doesn't socialize much and keeps her head down and does her job without making anyone uncomfortable. There's no reason for him to look twice at the tremor in her hands or the military-precise way she moves through patient rooms or the fact that she reads every single line item in the pharmacy logs like someone whose career depended on catching exactly this kind of thing. He's too busy watching the money. The ambulance bay doors crash open at 2:34 a.m., and the tranquility of the hospital's quiet hours shatters like glass hitting concrete. The alert screams across the intercom, incoming trauma, 5 minutes out, male, age unknown, multiple blunt force injuries, altered level of consciousness. The energy in the ER transforms instantly, the controlled rhythm of the night shift accelerating into something faster, sharper, more dangerous. Brooke's body reacts before her mind catches up, the shift happening in her spine, in her shoulders, in the way her left leg straightens despite the ache that's been building for hours. Muscle memory takes over. Muscle memory that comes from somewhere else entirely, from places that didn't have intercom systems or blood bank protocols or the luxury of knowing whether a casualty would survive the next 12 hours. She's in Bay 7 when the ambulance arrives, setting up the trauma response with the economy of movement that comes from having done this more times than she can count. Dressing tray. 2 large bore for setups. Typo negative at room temperature. The monitor ready. The crash cart positioned. All of it arranged like instruments on a surgical tray, everything within arm's reach, nothing in the way, because seconds matter when blood is leaving a body faster than the body can replace it. The patient arrives on a gurney that looks like a mobile crime scene. The John Doe is male, 50s maybe, his face so damaged that identification from appearance would be impossible. His left eye is swollen shut. His right arm hangs at an angle that suggests fracture rather than dislocation. His breathing is shallow, rapid, the breathing of someone whose body is running on emergency protocols, a man drowning in air. No wallet. No identification. No way to know who this person is or where he came from or whether anyone is waiting for him somewhere. Just a body, bleeding onto white sheets, and the universal truth of emergency medicine, the person matters less than the physics of keeping them alive. Brooke cuts away his blood-soaked shirt with trauma shears, the fabric falling away to reveal a chest covered in contusions, in the blooming purple of trauma that will look worse tomorrow. The smell hits her, copper blood, sweat, the sharp chemical signature of fear and adrenaline mixed with the antiseptic reek of the hospital itself. She's moving faster now, her hand steady, the tremor gone completely as if it never existed. The floor goes in smooth, the blood beginning to flow, and she's checking for breath sounds, palpating the abdomen, looking for the injuries that are trying to kill this man in real time. That's when the light catches the metal. A ball chain, thin and worn silver, hangs beneath the John Doe's sternum where his shirt has fallen away. Attached to the chain are 2 small rectangular pieces of metal stamped with letters and numbers. Dog tags. Military identification from someone who served, someone whose name and blood type and religion were stamped into metal decades ago and never quite removed, even in this place, even now. Her fingers freeze for exactly 3 seconds, not long enough for anyone to notice, not long enough for the tremor to return, but long enough for her entire world to shift on its axis. She lifts the chain into the overhead light. The letters emerge from the metal like a benediction or a curse, impossible and inevitable. Captain Marcus Webb, OPOS. Her breathing stops. Not the dramatic stop of hyperventilation or panic, but the controlled cessation of breath that comes from needing to hide the fact that your world has just ended. Marcus Webb was the commanding officer of 2nd Battalion, 5th Rangers, Ramadi deployment, the man who'd written the letter. The letter that arrived 3 weeks after her son Danny shipped out, the letter that said all the things a commanding officer is supposed to say about looking after his men, about bringing them home safe, about the honor of service and the brotherhood of the unit. The letter that had meant everything because it meant someone was watching over her boy in a place where the wrong person watching could mean the difference between coming home and staying there forever. The letter was dated 5 years ago. She slips the dog tags into her scrub pocket with the same practice motion she uses to pocket her phone or her badge, the movement invisible, the action complete before anyone could possibly have noticed. The metal is warm from his body, and she tucks it deep, deep enough that it can't fall out, deep enough that it belongs to her now in a way that might be theft but feels like salvation. That's when she sees the reflection in the glass partition between Bay 7 and the supply room. Dr. Mercer is standing in the doorway, his shoulders framed by the edge of the window, and he's smiling. Not the kind of smile that suggests kindness or camaraderie or anything approaching human connection. The kind of smile a surgeon makes when he's identified exactly where to cut. The kind that looks like a wolf showing its teeth. His eyes are tracking her hands, tracking the pocket where she slipped the dog tags, tracking the moment where her composure flickered just enough for someone trained to notice a flutter to recognize it as something more than professional concern. The room's fluorescent lights buzz overhead, indifferent. Sullivan, Dr. Mercer says, his voice carrying the precision of someone who knows exactly how words can be shaped into weapons. A moment, please. She doesn't turn around immediately. She finishes the 4, confirms the line, ensures the patient is stable. Only then does she straighten, control moving back into her body like water filling a glass, filling it completely, leaving no room for the tremor or the fear or the recognition of the fact that the man standing in her reflection now knows something is wrong. She turns to face him, and she sees the moment it happens, the moment his mind calculates the cost of what he thinks is observed. The silence after her words hangs in Mercer's office like surgical gauze saturated with blood. He stares at her for 3 seconds, long enough to calculate, to understand that she's just told him she's documented everything. Then his jaw tightens, a muscle flexing once beneath his skin like something trying to escape. He doesn't respond. He simply walks to his door, opens it, and says, "Security will escort you out. Pending investigation." She nods once. Turns. Walks out past the 4 residents hovering in the hallway, their faces flushed with the knowledge that something fundamental has shifted in the oxygen balance of the room. Thursday morning arrives with the weight of an execution. Grand rounds. Conference room B23 residents, for attending physicians, the kind of captive audience Mercer has been waiting for. Brooke stands against the back wall in her pressed scrubs, the fabric stiff from the budget laundromat 3 blocks from her apartment, and watches him pull up her chart on the projector screen. Substandard technique, Mercer announces, his voice crisp as a scalpel cutting through membrane. The image illuminates her notes from Tuesday. A central line placement. 17 minutes for a procedure that should take 8. Notice the delayed threading. The redundant confirmation checks. He circles her documentation with a laser pointer, red light marking errors like tumors on an X-ray. This is what happens when we lower our standards in nursing recruitment. Residents smirk into their clipboards. 1. A surgical intern no older than 24, whispers a nervous Nellie loud enough for the room to hear. The sound travels, small but devastating, landing against Brooke's ribs like a stone dropped in still water. She doesn't move. Doesn't blink. The trembling isn't fear. It's restraint. She's held this posture through 12 years of deployment cycles, through combat support hospitals in Ramadi where the power cuts lasted 14 hours and the screaming came from every direction at once. She can hold it here. Mercer turns to face the room. "Nurse Sullivan, perhaps you'd like to explain the delay in your documentation." One tear tracks down her cheek. She lets it fall. Wipes it away without breaking eye contact. When she speaks, her voice doesn't waver. Those redundant checks caught a manufacturing defect in catheter lot 47. Hairline fracture in the lumen. I filed the safety report Tuesday afternoon, should be in your inbox. Silence. The kind so thick you could suture in it. Mercer's face flashes, not red, but paler, the blood retreating inward like he's gone into shock. Nevertheless, he says finally. Efficiency matters. Precision matters. She nods. Returns to her position against the wall. Watches him move through the rest of grand rounds like a man walking against a current, his voice losing some of its surgical precision, his hands trembling almost imperceptibly when he holds the laser pointer. But that wasn't the worst part. 2 days later, at the 3rd floor vending machines, Mercer stages an impromptu teaching moment. For surgical interns clustered around him like he's distributing gospel. Brooke stands 3 feet away, feeding dollar bills into the slot, watching them disappear like she's feeding a god. The machine hums. She presses the button for a granola bar she can't afford on her current salary. Some people, Mercer says, never looking at her directly, struggle with complex cases. That's simply the reality. Some nurses excel in urgent care, perhaps school nursing, administrative work. Not everyone has the temperament for trauma. Not everyone belongs in a facility like this. The interns nod like puppets on synchronized strings. One steals a glance at Brooke, calculating, measuring whether Mercer's words are truth or theater. She closes the vending machine door. Turns to face them. The granola bar sits in her palm, a small weight. "Dr. Mercer," she says quietly, her voice pitched so only the interns can hear, "your post-operative infection rate is 11% above hospital average. I noticed when I was reviewing quality assurance data last week. Your complication metrics are in the 89th percentile for readmission rates. His face goes white. Then red. Then white again, like a light flickering before it burns out completely. My office, he says. Now. The walk feels like the distance between continents. Fluorescent lights buzz overhead. Her badge swings against her ribs with each step, a rhythm that matches her heartbeat, steady, controlled, the pulse of someone who has learned to separate her body from her fear. A nurse passes them in the hallway and does a double take, sensing the pressure differential between them, the way the air seems to compress in Mercer's wake. In his office, Mercer doesn't sit. The afternoon light cuts through the window at an angle that makes everything look painted in forensic evidence. There's been a discrepancy in yesterday's narcotic count, he says, his voice surgical and cold. Hydromorphone. 8 units missing from the locked dispensary. Security has reviewed the access logs. Your badge was the last one scanned at 11:36 p.m. She sees it then. The architecture of it. The way he's been building this foundation since her second week, since she started asking questions about phantom CT scans ordered for uninsured patients, 3 MRIs on charts with no corresponding diagnoses, written off at triple the normal billing code. Since she noticed the pattern. Since she began documenting everything. There will be an investigation, Mercer continues. It's standard protocol. Security will escort you from the building. You're on unpaid administrative leave pending the outcome. Your credentials will be flagged with the state board. He's dismantling her cover in real time. Piece by piece. The nursing license, the hospital credentials, the invisible work she's been doing for 8 months, all of it collapsing like a structure engineered to fail. In her jacket pocket, the faded unit patch sewn into the lining feels impossibly heavy, a weight that might drag her straight down into the earth. But there's one thing Mercer doesn't know. One thing she logged an hour ago, sitting in the pharmacy system at 11:38 p.m., while her badge was supposedly nowhere near the locked dispensary because it was attached to her scrubs currently being worn by the night shift nurse in Bay 9, the one who owed her a favor after Brooke had covered her daughter's hospital bill from the charity fund no one else knew about. Interesting timing, doctor, she says. One tear tracks down her face. She wipes it away without breaking contact. Given what I logged in the pharmacy system an hour ago. His expression doesn't change immediately, but something in the air shifts. The oxygen feels thinner. What exactly did you log, Nurse Sullivan? A request, she says, for a full audit of your personal pharmaceutical orders from the past 3 years. With documentation of the billing codes that don't match any procedures in patient charts. The ones written off to phantom patients, John does, expired visitors, discharge names that don't exist. I estimated the total at approximately $2.3 million. Mercer's face goes absolutely white. The silence lasts exactly 3 seconds. Then he reaches for his phone. She watches him dial. Knows who he's calling before he speaks, the board chairman, the one who'd used Mercer for a cosmetic procedure on his wife, who'd owed him favors in a currency only the wealthy truly understand. Then the Texas Medical Association investigator, a man whose campaign had received Mercer's donations, whose career depended on maintaining certain friendships in certain rooms. There's been a development with the Sullivan investigation, Mercer says into the phone, his voice steady now, recalibrated, dangerous. Yes. I want to accelerate the timeline. Yes. This afternoon if possible. We're building a strong case for diversion. Termination papers. Yes. Immediately. She turns and walks out without being dismissed. Behind her, Mercer is already moving through his list of favors, calling in obligations, activating the network that had taken him 15 years to construct, a network of board members and regulatory officials and lawyers who understood that sometimes the price of survival was making someone else disappear. What he doesn't know is that someone is about to arrive in Seattle with a helicopter and a very different authority structure. What he doesn't know is that Captain Brooke Sullivan, the woman he's been trying to dismantle for 8 months, has been documenting every single piece of evidence in systems he never knew existed, filing reports to addresses he couldn't find if he tried, and at the moment she logged that audit request, somewhere in the Pentagon, someone picked up a phone that very few people knew how to call. 11 p.m. The fluorescent lights hummed their endless mechanical prayer, and the night shift was thinning to its skeleton crew, 2 nurses charting in the break room, 1 resident sleeping in the call room, the whole of Seattle General held in that peculiar silence that only comes when the city outside has surrendered to dark. Brooke Sullivan sat at the medication cart on the 3rd floor, her paperwork for the evening complete, her logs filed, her mind already halfway through the rehearse tomorrow, clock out, drive the speed limit, don't be memorable. The last thing she needed was to be memorable. But something pulled her toward Bay 7. It wasn't protocol. It wasn't a page on her badge. It wasn't even a conscious decision, just the muscle memory of 14 years, 8 deployments, and 3 combat tours whispering that something was wrong. She'd learned in Ramadi that intuition wasn't magic, it was pattern recognition, her nervous system catching details her conscious mind hadn't processed yet. A monitor tone. A subtle change in the rhythm of the building. The air pressure dropping like a barometer before a storm. She walked through the empty corridor. Bay 7 sat dark, the John Doe still unconscious, his chest rising and falling with the mechanical precision of his fur fluids. He hadn't moved since they'd admitted him 8 hours ago. No visitors. No identification. No answers. Just a man in his early 50s, blooded from the mugging, stable enough to transfer to the floor by morning. But now, as Brooke moved closer, the fluorescent light caught something on his chest. A glint. Metal against tan hospital gown. Dog tags. They hung from a thin silver chain, partially caught beneath the gown's neckline, and when she leaned in, careful, clinical, the perfect picture of routine post-shift observation, she read the engraving, Captain Marcus Webb, OPOS. The room tilted. She knew that name the way you know the voice of someone who's held your child. Captain Marcus Webb. 2nd Battalion, 5th Rangers. The company commander who'd written the letter, the carefully formal military letter that she'd read 17 times while her son Danny was in Kandahar, the one that promised to bring him home safe, to watch his 6, to make sure he came back whole. The letter from a man whose word meant something. The letter from the man lying unconscious in front of her. Brooke's fingers moved without permission, slipping the dog tags carefully from beneath the gown. OPOS. Her son's blood type 2, some genetic lottery that meant something in the calculus of emergency medicine. She read the tags again, confirming what her hands already knew, Marcus Webb. Ranger. The promise. The footsteps came from the hallway, moving fast, not the hurried shuffle of a resident, but the deliberate stride of someone with authority, someone with purpose. Dr. Mercer appeared in the doorway, his white coat immaculate, his smile surgical and cold, the kind of smile that didn't reach eyes that had already made their decision. Behind him, the hallway was empty. Just the 2 of them, and the unconscious captain, and the dog tags now pressed against Brooke's palm. Nurse Sullivan, Mercer said, stepping into the bay. His voice carried the precise enunciation of someone performing for an audience of 1. You're still here. Past the end of your shift. She didn't flinch. She didn't blink. She slipped the dog tags into her scrub pocket, the metal cold against her thigh, and when she met Mercer's eyes, her face was the perfect mask of routine competence. Patient care, she said. Of course. Mercer moved closer, and she could smell his cologne, something expensive, something that didn't belong in a hospital, mixing with the antiseptic and the faint copper of blood. That's admirable, really. Your dedication. Though it's about to become a significant liability. He withdrew a printed document from inside his coat, holding it at arm's length like something diseased. I've just come from a call with Patricia Hendricks at the Texas Medical Association. She's very interested in some discrepancies she found in our pharmacy logs. Particularly the ones from your last 3 shifts. Brooke looked at the document without reaching for it. The words blurred, but she caught the important ones: immediate suspension, narcotic diversion investigation, security escort to the premises, pending termination review. When can she speak with me? Brooke kept her voice level, conversational. The voice of someone discussing the weather. She's already on her way from Dallas. Mercer tilted his head, watching her like a surgeon watches a scalpel slide through tissue. Should be here by morning. In the meantime, I'm asking you to step away from patient care. Consider it a precaution. He glanced at Webb's monitor, at the steady rhythm, at the vitals that were holding. Dr. Richardson will take over this patient's assignments. You're to clock out and return to your locker to gather personal items. Security will observe the process. The dog tags felt impossibly heavy in her pocket, a weight that seemed to press against her ribs more than her leg. Webb's O2 sat at 92%. His heart rate was 68. Everything stable. Everything wrong. I understand, Brooke said. Mercer's smile widened. I thought you would. He turned, his footsteps already taking him toward the door, toward the hallway, toward the machinery he'd set in motion, the calls he'd made, the allies he'd activated, the network of obligation and owed favors that made him untouchable in his own hospital. Security will be by your locker at 7 a.m. Don't be late. She watched him go, watching the hallway swallow him, watching the moment when her cover and her mission and her ability to protect Webb stopped intersecting and started colliding. At 1:06 a.m., her phone vibrated. A text from a number she'd memorized but never called, extraction authorized. Mission failure. RTB. Return to base. Get out. The Pentagon had released her. The operation was over. She had perhaps 3 hours before Mercer's investigator arrived, before security locked her out, before the whole careful architecture of Captain Brooke Sullivan's civilian life collapsed into rubble. She stayed in Base 7. She reviewed Webb's labs at 2:14 a.m. She traced the 4 lines. She checked the medications queued in the pharmacy system, all routine, all standing orders, all exactly what a stable post-trauma patient would receive. And at 2:41 a.m., as she was adjusting the 4 rate, Webb's breathing changed. Just slightly. A hesitation. A pause. She'd heard that sound in the Bagram ER. She'd heard it in the field hospital in Jalabad when a corporal's pneumothorax had collapsed without warning. She'd heard it in the nightmare that visited her every 4th Tuesday. The sound of a lung folding in on itself. His left lung had filled with air, the pressure building between the visceral and parietal pleura, collapsing the tissue into a useless sac. A tension pneumothorax. The kind that kills you in minutes if you don't move. Get back up, Brooke said, already moving, her hands finding the sterile needle kit before her conscious mind had finished assessing the emergency. The resident who'd been monitoring Webb's ICU overflow, Dr. Chen, 26 years old, first rotation, was already frozen, one hand on the call button, eyes wide. You can't, he said. You're not authorized. You're under investigation. Brooke's hands moved on their own. She prepped his chest with betadine, the orange iodine sharp against her sense of smell. Second intercostal space, mid-clavicular line. The anatomy of survival. The geography of rescue. She found the space between his ribs the way a cartographer reads a map, and when she inserted the 14-gauge angiocath needle, the relief was immediate and absolute, the hiss of escaping air, that whisper of pressure release, the sound of someone's body surrendering its burden. Webb's oxygen saturation, which had been dropping like a stone, stopped its fall. 88%. 90%. 92%. She secured the catheter, her movements precise and economical, every gesture executed with the terrifying fluid precision of someone who'd done this under fire, in the dark, in the mud, with nothing but training and desperation. She started a second full line with one of the expired saline bags from the crash cart, the only stock available at this hour, the only option that mattered, and began the fluid resuscitation that would keep him stable until real help could arrive. Dr. Chen was still frozen, his phone now in his hand, already dialing. I'm calling the attending, he said, and Brooke nodded once, already documenting everything, every intervention noted with timestamps and her name and her license number, creating a record that would either protect her or destroy her depending on who read it first. For the next 5 hours, Brooke Sullivan kept Captain Marcus Webb alive. She monitored his oxygen saturation with the focus of a sniper tracking distance. 94. 96. Holding. She recalculated his fluid needs using the Parkland formula, accounting for the hours already elapsed, adjusting for the metabolic stress of the tension pneumothorax, keeping his blood pressure stable with nothing but the precision of her hands and the mathematics of survival. At 3:17 a.m., she noticed his electrolytes would begin to drift. At 4:02 a.m., she checked for the early signs of compartment syndrome in his left leg. At 4:44 a.m., she repositioned him with the gentleness of someone who knows that movement, at the wrong angle, could trigger another collapse. Pain was information. Pain was data. Every monitor tone, every subtle shift in his breathing, every minute fluctuation in his heart rate, all of it was the body's language, and Brooke had been fluent in that language since her first deployment. At 4:53 a.m., Dr. Mercer arrived with Patricia Hendricks and 2 security officers. The woman from the Texas Medical Association was younger than Brooke had expected, maybe 40, with the kind of constructed authority that comes from a 6-figure salary and legal backup. She carried a leather portfolio and wore the expression of someone who'd already made her judgment. Mercer's smile was generous. Magnanimous. The smile of a man who'd already won. "Nurse Sullivan," he began, and Brooke didn't look up from Webb's monitor, her hand steady as she adjusted the infusion rate. "Ms. Hendricks needs to speak with you about your access to controlled substances. I also need you to know that I'm placing you on immediate administrative leave pending full investigation. You're no longer authorized to provide patient care on this unit." Brooke finished documenting the medication adjustment. She marked the time, 4:53 a.m. She recorded the vital signs, BP 118/72, HR 72, O2 96%, pain level 0 due to continued sedation. She turned from the monitor to face them, her movements controlled, her jaw set with the quiet discipline of someone whose next words would matter. "This patient is critically stable," she said. Her voice had dropped. It carried weight now, the weight of authority, the weight of someone who'd held lives together in her bare hands. He was in acute respiratory distress from a collapsed left lung. "I performed emergency needle decompression at 2:41 a.m. using a 14-gauge angiocath at the second intercostal space, midclavicular line. His oxygen saturation was falling, he would have arrested within 10 minutes. I documented every intervention. All records are in the system." Dr. Chen appeared in the doorway, eyes still wide, hands trembling. "Everything she said is accurate," he said quietly. "She saved his life. If she hadn't been here, he'd be dead." Mercer's smile thinned. Patricia Hendricks was already making notes, her pen moving with the efficiency of someone calculating liability. "Nevertheless," Mercer said, "you're no longer authorized." "I need some jello," Brooke said, and something in the room shifted. It was so perfectly, absurdly normal, so exactly what a nurse who'd just pulled an all-nighter would say in the presence of bureaucratic nonsense, that for a moment, Mercer seemed to lose his thread. She was already moving past him, already heading toward the medication station, already returning to the ordinary work of keeping a man alive. The portfolio and the badge and the administrative authority seemed suddenly very small against the fact of Webb's stable vital signs, against the oxygen flowing into his lungs, against the blood pressure that was holding because of her hands and her knowledge and the 14 hours of Army Ranger combat medicine she'd spent the last 8 months disguising as ordinary competence. At 5:31 a.m., her personal phone buzzed again, exfil window closing. "Status report." She didn't respond. She was too busy watching Webb's monitors, calculating the half-life of the expired saline in his veins, keeping him breathing in the darkness before dawn. The Pentagon would wait. Mercer would wait. The whole architecture of consequence and accountability would wait. Captain Marcus Webb, who had promised to bring her son home, was still alive. And that was the only measure that mattered. The needle decompression took for seconds. Brooke's hands moved on their own, muscle memory from Ramadi screaming through her nervous system as she located the second intercostal space, midclavicular line, and drove the 14-gauge angiocath needle through Webb's chest wall. The hiss of air escaping. That sound. The same sound she'd heard 100 times in a canvas tent while mortars walked toward the perimeter. Webb's O2 sat had been 68. Plummeting. The on-call resident, a fourth-year named Chen, had frozen with a stethoscope in his hand, his mouth opening and closing like he was trying to remember what breathing felt like. Mercer's resident. Useless. Brooke didn't ask permission. She ran the needle in, taped it, and watched the numbers climb. 72, 78. 82, stable. Webb's chest rose and fell, the lung re-inflating with a sound like fabric tearing against the inside of his ribs. Chen found his voice. Did you? That's not protocol, that's... He was dead. Brooke was already moving to the second line, a second needle positioned over the fourth intercostal space. Backup decompression. Field medicine. Ramadi had taught her that redundancy kept people breathing. Now his not. She didn't make eye contact with anyone. There were 3 nurses watching, 2 residents, and Mercer himself standing in the doorway with his jaw clenched so tight she could see the muscle working. His eyes were the color of a shark's, all appetite and no mercy, cataloguing every unauthorized move she made. Every protocol violation. Every reason to accelerate his timeline. The next 5 hours lived in a space outside of normal time. Brooke worked in the PSYCU, surgical intensive care, where Webb's lung had stabilized enough that nobody was ready to transport him to the OR yet. Pneumothorax controlled. Breathing adequate. But the monitoring equipment was ancient, the ventilator wheels squeaking like rats trapped in the walls, and the expired supplies in the crash cart made her hands shake with a rage that looked like nothing because she was trained to look like nothing. Expired chest tubes from 2019. Dried suction tubing. An intercostal catheter with a date stamp she had to squint to read in the fluorescent overhead light. Everything about this hospital was a monument to penny-pinching that killed people slowly, quietly, where nobody had to see the bodies or answer uncomfortable questions. She used what she had. Hands that had sutured a femoral artery bleed with tent canvas and a prayer. Hands that had packed a bullet wound with gauze and duct tape and held a man's organs inside his body for 3 hours because the medevac helicopters weren't flying that night. Those hands knew how to work with nothing. How to keep people alive when the institution failed them. At midnight, she was the only one in the PSYCU with Webb. The lights dimmed to a soft yellow that made everything look drowned. She checked his vitals, his dressings, the expired for fluids that were all the hospital would authorize because his insurance had already been denied once. His consciousness flickered in and out like a faulty radio signal. "Captain," she whispered, adjusting the ventilator settings. "You stay. That's the mission." His eyes opened. Unfocused. Drowning. She increased the oxygen percentage and watched the monitors stabilize. The trembling in her hands wasn't fear. It was restraint. It was knowing she was fighting a hospital system as dangerous as any enemy she'd faced. At 1:11 a.m., her phone buzzed. A text on a line that shouldn't have had text. A number that only one person in the world used. Extraction authorized. Mission failure. RTB. Return to base. The word sat on the screen like a death sentence. She was supposed to monitor Webb, document his survival, keep him stable until the Pentagon's counter-fraud task force could move against Mercer's network. She was supposed to be invisible. Disposable. A ghost operating inside the hospital system, watching a high-value target who'd been asking too many questions about contractor fraud before his convenient mugging in a parking garage 3 weeks ago. Instead, she'd burned everything. Her cover had fractured the moment she saw those dog tags. Her hands had moved before her brain could calculate the cost. And now the Pentagon was ordering her to disappear because staying meant exposure, means blown operations, means 3 years of deep work dissolving into nothing. She looked at Webb's face, the bandaged shoulder, the swollen jaw, the monitor reading his heart rate at 89 and climbing toward consciousness. He'd written a letter to her son. Had promised Danny that he'd come home from Ramadi, that his commanding officer had his back, that the Rangers don't leave Rangers behind. That promise had become a rope that Brooke had held onto during the worst nights. Had become the reason she'd taken this assignment. had become the reason she was standing here at 1:08 a.m. destroying her own mission to keep a man alive. At 3 a.m., she sat in the Denny's across the street from Seattle General, in a corner booth that smelled like old grease and broken dreams, and watched her coffee go cold. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead like insects trapped in plastic. The waitress refilled her cup without asking, without meeting her eyes, a gesture of 3 a.m. kindness that almost broke something inside Brooke, something she'd kept locked down since Ramadi. Her phone sat on the table. The message still waiting for acknowledgement. Still demanding that she disappear. She'd been working as a phantom inside Seattle General for 18 months. Living in a studio apartment under a borrowed name. Watching Dr. Mercer systematize fraud with the precision of a surgeon, except his cuts open people's bank accounts instead of saving lives. Phantom CT scans for uninsured patients, written off at triple cost. Surgical procedures that never happened, billed to Medicare at $47,000 a unit. Kickbacks to durable medical equipment suppliers who'd send equipment nobody needed and bill insurance companies for equipment they never sent. 1,000 small crimes that added up to $2.3 million in stolen money. Webb had discovered parts of it. Had started asking questions about contractor billing when he was supposed to be quiet and healing from a mugging that wasn't a mugging at all. Had nearly gotten himself killed for knowing too much. And Brooke had pulled a needle through his chest and kept him alive when every protocol and every mission parameter and every order from her handler said she should let the Pentagon handle it, should maintain her cover, should stay invisible. She stared at her reflection in the cold coffee and saw a woman who'd failed at everything that mattered. A waitress appeared, refilled the cup. The coffee steamed, disturbing the image in the surface. Brooke watched it fragment and reform. At 6 a.m., her phone buzzed again. A different number. A voice she hadn't heard in 3 years. Sullivan. It's Major Clayton, 2nd Battalion. We need you back at the hospital. She didn't respond. Couldn't. The silence stretched like pulled taffy. Your son is on his way. He's carrying something. Something important. The line went dead. Brooke sat in the empty booth and understood that the extraction order had already been countermanded. That someone inside the Pentagon had decided a mission failure was less important than what she discovered inside the hospital. That her son, her beautiful, 17-year-old son who was supposed to be safe and far away from her other life, was walking towards Seattle General carrying a shadow box from her attic. Carrying proof. She had 90 minutes before Mercer arrived to sign the termination papers. 90 minutes before her cover completely dissolved. 90 minutes before the Pentagon's counter-fraud task force made the call that would end everything they'd all been protecting. She left $20 on the table and walked back toward the hospital. The rain was starting, thin and cold, slicking the parking lot asphalt until it looked like broken glass. The sun was rising somewhere behind the clouds. The city was waking up. By noon, everything she'd built would be destroyed. And then everything would begin. Brooke's pen hovered above the termination papers when the door exploded inward. 17-year-old Danny stood in the doorway in dress uniform so crisp it could cut glass, his shoulders squared like he'd been practicing this moment for months, and in his trembling hands he carried a shadow box, the one she'd hidden in the attic behind winter storage, the one she'd never intended anyone to see. Dr. Mercer's face twisted. Security will, but Danny crossed the room like he'd crossed 1,000 patrol bases, deliberate and unstoppable, and set the shadow box on Mercer's desk with the reverence of a soldier placing a folded flag. Inside, catching the fluorescent light like captured fire, her silver star. Her purple heart. 2 of them, actually, small violet rectangles that held entire minutes of her life, moments when she'd chosen to stay when every nerve screamed to run. "Mom, they need to see these," Danny whispered, and his voice was breaking. Mercer stared at the medals, his mouth opening and closing like a fish pulled from water. That was when Captain Marcus Webb was wheeled into the office by 2 MPs in dress blues, his hospital gown replaced with a borrowed jacket, his left arm still wrapped but his eyes sharp as field-stripped rifle components. Webb's gaze locked on Brooke's face, and he whispered 2 words that made Mercer's skin go the color of old bone, Valkyrie 6 Actual. The room didn't just go silent. The room stopped existing. Mercer's hand dropped from his desk. Someone in the hallway gasped, a nurse, probably, recognizing the call sign, understanding what it meant. Valkyrie 6 Actual was a Ranger designation. Valkyrie 6 Actual was command-level authority. Valkyrie 6 Actual was not a night shift emergency room nurse who asked questions about billing codes. The door opened again, and a Marine colonel entered first, tall enough to make the office feel suddenly small, ribbon stacked on his chest like a geography of conflicts, followed by a 3-star general in dress greens, and when that general saw Brooke, he moved into a salute so sharp it could cut glass, his fist striking his chest with the sound of a firing pin. "Captain Sullivan," the general said, his voice like a tank idling in a garage, controlled and immense. "The Pentagon's counter-fraud task force sends their regards." Not a request. A command. An acknowledgement. A promise kept from the sky itself. Mercer's face was the color of ash now, his jaw working soundlessly. The general didn't look at him. None of them did. They looked at Brooke like she was the only real thing in the room, and when her son Danny moved to her side, slipping his hand into hers, the transformation was complete. The invisible nurse, the woman who'd absorbed his contempt like body armor, suddenly rendered in relief as something else entirely. Something with authority that didn't need to be announced because it moved the air itself. The phone on Mercer's desk rang. The general gestured to the speakerphone, and Mercer's trembling hand moved to answer it. A woman's voice crackled through, professional and lethal. "This is Deputy Assistant Secretary Catherine Reeves, Pentagon Inspector General's office. We're initiating a federal investigation into fraudulent billing practices at Seattle General Hospital spanning approximately 18 months, with preliminary findings indicating approximately $2.3 million in falsified insurance claims orchestrated by Dr. Edmund Mercer. Medical licenses in 3 states are being suspended immediately. We're executing search warrants on his office at 1,400 hours. We're also notifying Medicare fraud enforcement and the FBI's Healthcare Crimes Division. Captain Sullivan's documentation of narcotic discrepancies, billing anomalies, and phantom procedures has been cross-referenced with our analysis. The patterns are unmistakable." The line went dead. Mercer sat frozen, and that's when someone in the hallway started filming, a resident, maybe, or a nurse whose faith in the system had just been restored in real time. The phone, the general, the medals, the 3-star salute, all of it compressed into 30 seconds of viral content that would climb to 1 million views by noon. Mercer's face in the footage was the expression of a man watching his entire architecture collapse in accelerated time. But that wasn't the worst part. That wasn't even close. Because at 1 p.m., when the video had already hit 500,000 views and Seattle General's board was convening emergency session behind locked doors, a comment appeared from a verified account. Dr. Raymond Chen, former Surgeon General, Mercer's medical school mentor, the man whose recommendation had launched Mercer's entire career. "I taught him better than this." 50 words. 50 devastating words that appeared under a photo of Mercer's face going white at the general's announcement. "I taught him that medicine is a sacred trust, not a revenue stream. I taught him that the Hippocratic Oath means something. I taught him wrong if this is what he became." The comment was pinned to the top. It was shared 50,000 times in the first 4 hours. It was quoted in medical ethics seminars before the day was even over. Mercer tried to call his network, the board chairman whose wife's cosmetic procedures he'd referred for years, the investigator who'd received his campaign donations, the lawyer drafting termination papers, but every single connection was suddenly unavailable, every single ally suddenly recused or under review or already distancing themselves from the blast radius of his collapse. By 4 p.m., Seattle General's board had suspended his privileges. By 6 p.m., security was packing his office. By 8 p.m., he was being escorted from the building by guards who didn't make eye contact and checked his briefcase for hospital property. The walk from the elevator to the exit took 90 seconds. Staff lined the hallway in silence, watching. Someone held up a phone, recording, and Mercer kept his head down. Outside, news cameras waited like hungry wolves. His wife filed for divorce on day 3, citing irreconcilable differences and financial impropriety. His medical licenses suspended across Texas, Washington, and California within 2 weeks. His Wikipedia page updated before midnight. Within a month, he was teaching CPR to bored teenagers at San Antonio Community College for $16 an hour, a court-ordered community service position that felt less like atonement and more like erasure. The man who'd built his career on visibility, on grand rounds performances and institutional power, now invisible in a way he'd never intended, standing before teenagers who'd never heard his name, demonstrating chest compressions on a plastic dummy while his federal trial date approached like an execution. But that was 6 months away. In this moment, in Mercer's office at Seattle General, with Danny's hand in her mother's hand and Webb's whispered call sign still hanging in the air like a confession, Brooke Sullivan stood at a threshold that the Pentagon had just crossed for her. The choice she'd been planning to make, reclaim her Army identity or die as a civilian nurse, had been taken from her in the time it took a 17-year-old boy to carry his mother's medals across an office and a 3-star general to render a salute that made the air itself understand what authority actually meant. Her handler's extraction authorization was already being overridden by someone higher in the chain, someone who understood that the quiet person in the room, the night shift nurse who counted narcotics at 2 a.m. and noticed the patterns no one else would see, was exactly where she was supposed to be. Not hidden anymore. Not invisible. Visible in a way that made Mercer's entire career look like a performance by someone who'd never understood what it meant to have something real. Danny squeezed her hand. Webb nodded from his gurney, a small gesture, a ranger's acknowledgement that the mission had just entered a new phase. The general was already leaving, his work complete, and when Brooke looked at her son's face, she could see the moment he truly understood. His mother had never been in danger from this hospital. His mother had been the danger all along, waiting for the right moment to show her teeth. The Pentagon had just given her permission to stop hiding. And now the question wasn't whether she could survive as a civilian nurse. The question was what she was supposed to do with the rest of her Army life, the one that had just been returned to her in a shadow box full of medals and a general salute and a son who'd finally seen his mother as something other than the woman who raised him. He saw the soldier now. He saw the legend. And he was looking at her like she was finally home. If you've ever been underestimated by someone who had no idea who they were standing next to, you know that feeling, the moment when everything changes and the person who hurt you suddenly understands they were playing a game against an opponent they never knew existed. If you've served or loved someone who served, you know what it means when a 3-star general renders a salute to a nurse. That's the story of Captain Brooke Sullivan, and that's exactly why she's been called the quietest person in the room who might just be holding it all together. If you've enjoyed this story, please like, subscribe, and tell us in the comments, what would you have done if you'd held a secret that could change everything? Would you have kept it buried, or would you have let it burn everything down? Let us know, and thank you for watching.